In this episode, I'm going to walk you through a self-audit that you can do with your podcast to determine if your show's in the right category, or if you're launching a podcast for the first time, to figure out which category you need to position yourself within. This is going to be super important if you want to get discovered by new listeners who are cold to you, but who need whatever it is you have to offer. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Picking a show category confuses people, and rightfully so, because there's so many categories to choose from. Sometimes more than one category might be applicable for your podcast, and there's not usually any good information out there on Google or YouTube or anywhere else from other podcast experts talking about how specifically to choose a show category for your specific show based on your specific show goals. So if you look inside of your podcast hosting platform, so that's going to be Libsyn or Blueberry or Buzzsprout. We use Buzzsprout. On the back end, if you log into that, once you have your hosting platform set up, you're going to see a spot where you can put up to 3 categories for your show. Now, Apple only cares about the first one, so that's the one we're going to focus on inside of this episode. However, just to note, it is important to fill out all 3 because this is going to help best position you both on Apple and other podcast players who may use all 3 to categorize your show. So the first thing you want to do is figure out what are the categories on Apple. And sometimes people don't know where to go to get this information. So just go open up your favorite web browser, whether it's Google or Bing or whatever it is that you use, and type in podcasts.apple.com and search for show categories. Alternately, you can just type in Apple Podcast categories into Google and it'll pull right up. And what you're going to notice is it's going to pull up a list of 2 types of categories. We're going to see parent categories and we're going to see subcategories. As a general rule of thumb, we always recommend to our students to avoid the parent category. So what I mean by parent categories, if you're looking at that list of categories from Apple, you're going to see business. And then under business, you're going to see entrepreneurship, marketing, careers, investing, and on and on. And you'll see this with other categories too. So the parent category would be business, and then the categories underneath would be the subcategories. So typically we want to go into a subcategory because the parent category is going to be the collection of all the podcasts in all the subcategories underneath it. That said, there are still some pretty competitive subcategories. And so this is where some strategy comes into play. So what you're going to do is look at that list. And of the subcategories, I want you to make a short list of potential subcategories that your podcast could fit into. So for example, with this podcast, we could fit into how-to, we could fit into marketing, we might be able to fit into entrepreneurship because that's who our target audience is. And you'll notice this for your podcast too. You might have more than one category where your show could potentially fit. And this is where people tend to get stuck because they're like, well, I don't know which one to position my show in. Which one's better? Which one's going to help me more? Is there one that's going to help me grow faster than another one? Where do I go to figure this out? So what I usually recommend is in order to pick the best category, there's 2 important things that you need to consider to narrow down your shortlist. And let me go ahead and define the word best here for you too, because by best, I mean the most advantageous for your podcast launch and increasing your ranking potential from that point forward. And if you have an existing podcast, then this is also going to be equally applicable because for our students, we always recommend that they relaunch their podcasts. And we want to make sure that you are positioned in a category that will help you increase your ranking potential, both now and over time. So the first thing we want to consider, and this is a question you'll need to ask yourself, is where are my listeners most likely to search for a podcast like mine? The 2 places that listeners tend to look for podcasts. Number 1, keyword search. This is why keywords are so important, but that's a different episode for a different day. Number 2, they browse categories. And you might have done this before as well. Let's say you're looking for a new health and fitness podcast to listen to. And so you go and either you're going to type in fitness podcasts or workout podcasts or strength training podcasts, or you might go to the health and fitness category and just scroll to see what catches your eye. Now, what you're scrolling when you're looking at that on your podcast app is the charts. And you hear me say this all the time. This is why it's so important that we position your show to get you on those charts as often as possible, because this is where you're going to be more likely to get discovered by new listeners who are using the charts to find new shows to listen to. So that's the first thing to consider. Where are your listeners most likely to search for a podcast like yours? The next thing you want to consider, of those categories, it's ideal if we can figure out which one of those is going to be the least competitive to position your show within to start, so that you can gain the most momentum possible. You've heard me say this before. Early momentum is so key, both for the immediate and the long-term growth of your podcast. So what we want to do next is we want to focus on which category has fewer potential podcasts. So already just by looking at the subcategories, this is good. This is a step in the right direction. And then we want to consider, of those categories, which one is my listener most likely looking for shows like mine? And then consider that. And then the last piece of this is we want to consider, if there is one of those categories and there's still multiple contenders on your list, we want to figure out which one of those is most likely to be a quieter category. And by quieter, I mean has fewer podcasts to compete with. Similar to how back in episode 211, we talked about why releasing episodes on the quietest day of the week in your category can give you an advantage and help your show increase its ranking potential. This will also help to increase the ranking potential of your show if you're in a category where there's fewer podcasts to compete with. Now, I will caveat this and say this is not always going to be possible to do. Sometimes your show is just going to fit in the category it fits in, and that category is going to be competitive. And then what we have to do is figure out how many downloads do we need in order to increase your chance of ranking in that category. And my team does this for our clients, where over the last 4+ years of working with students and helping them launch their podcasts, we have collected all that data from previous client launches, and we know to pinpoint how many downloads a new student coming into the program is likely to need based on the category they are looking to position their show within. Now, people ask me all the time, Courtney, which category is the least competitive? Where can I go to see how many shows are in a category? And unfortunately, there is nowhere to go to get this information. There is nowhere on the internet that exists. Like I said, we've been collecting data for the last 4 years just to be able to help our clients better fine-tune this part of the process. But let's just say that you have a podcast, and let's say that podcast is about money and it's about wealth, and it's from a Christian perspective. So let's say that on your shortlist, you have 3 categories. You've narrowed down entrepreneurship because that's who you're speaking to. You've narrowed down investing because that's what you're speaking about. And you've narrowed down Christianity because that is also the angle from which you are speaking and presenting this topic. So if we look at those 3 categories on the short list, then we can intuitively say, okay, let me think about my listener here for a second. Which one of these categories would they be most likely to look for a show like mine? And in this case, I'm basing this example off of a real student that we have, where because there are so many podcasts about investing and entrepreneurship and money and making money, and her angle is so completely opposite of those, her listeners are likely not looking. They might be looking in the investing category for investing advice, but they're not resonating with the shows that are in the investing category. So they might be exploring other categories to see if there's anything else that might speak to them. For example, Christianity, because they're looking for that Christian outlook or take on money and wealth. So the goal here is we want to give your podcast the best chance of gaining a foothold in the category that you're in. Now, in doing the research, this particular student found that there are no podcasts about money in the Christianity category. So her strategy, and intuitively for her, she's like, based on the research that you guys have done in helping me figure this out, and also where I'm intuitively feeling that my listener is likely going to be looking for this stuff, Christianity needs to be my number 1 category, because this is where my listeners are going to go because they're not finding information in the other categories. And this particular category is going to give me more of a foothold because I'm going to be first on the scene, so to speak, in this category by being the first one to talk about these topics from this perspective. So sometimes picking a category will be pretty cut and dry. We've had other students who come in and it's like mental health, mental health, mental health. That's the only one that fits. That's the one we go into. So what if it's competitive? We know how many downloads we need in order to potentially rank in that category. And we help our students set up their launch in order to do that and increase the potential of them ranking as much as possible. For other students, like the one I just gave you in the example, sometimes without the data, it's going to be more of an intuitive process. And this is why that first key point is so important. Consider, where are your listeners most likely looking for a show like yours? Then we just want to look at which category has a gap that I can fill. And of these categories, is there one that intuitively feels like it would be a bit more advantageous for me to position my show within so that I can increase my chance of not just ranking, but gaining momentum for my podcast? Because here's the thing. You can change your primary category at any time without any impact to your listeners. They won't even know. So from a strategic standpoint, it would make the most sense and be most advantageous for you to position your show in a category that's going to allow you to gain momentum and build momentum. And then down the road, if you want to switch categories, guess what? You're going to take all that momentum and traction you've gained with you to the new category where maybe it is more competitive. So that's what you really need to look at is, who are my main competitors in my category? Who am I really competing with? And even though there's no specific place to go and look and see exactly how many downloads some of these shows are getting, you might hear some of these bigger hosts say, welcome to the podcast with over 1 million downloads per episode, right? And sometimes we're able to figure out how many downloads those shows are likely pulling in per episode, because then we know that's what we're up against. And if that's the game we're playing, and this simply is downloads drive the charts, and I want to get on the charts, then we need to best position our podcasts to give ourselves the most opportunity to do that. So for this particular student who I'm giving you this example with entrepreneurship and investing in Christianity, her number one category for now is going to be Christianity. Her goal there is to gain her foothold there over the next year and then reevaluate and see where she is. Her second and third categories are going to be investing and entrepreneurship. Now, maybe in the future, if her show gains a lot of traction and she eventually wants to switch her categories, totally fine. She can do that. She'll pull all that momentum with her. So when it comes to show categories, that's what you need to consider. Number one, which category is my listener most likely looking for a show like mine? Number two, looking at the competition in that category as best you can, figuring out where are the gaps that you can fill, and leaning into your intuition here and picking the category that makes the most sense for your show. And then picking your additional categories for positions 2 and 3 inside of your hosting platform. Because again, there may be other players that use this information to further categorize your show with the ultimate goal of getting your show in front of as many new listeners as possible. So to wrap this up, the first thing you're going to do is go pull up that list of Apple categories. Avoid the parent categories and make a short list of subcategories where your show is likely to fit. Then of that list, ask yourself, okay, of these categories, which one is my listener most likely to be searching in? And then of these, which one makes the most sense for my show right now based on the content gaps that I can fill and looking at the competition within your category. And then you'll just put that category as your primary category inside of your hosting provider. And then if you have any additional categories to help further categorize your show, just put those in your number 2 and your number 3 spot. And if this was helpful for you, I would love it if you would let me know by leaving a review or sending me a DM. I'm on Instagram. I'm a real person. Come find me there. I'm at the Courtney Elmer. And in the next episode, I'm going to have global tech founder and AI expert Manoj Agarwal in the studio with me to talk about some of the biggest mistakes that people make when using AI for their podcast. And we're going to talk about how to leverage AI tools for your show to save you time without making you sound like everyone else. So if you want to find out how to do that, head on over to the next episode with me to make your business binge-worthy.